Welcome back to Quietly Secure. Over the last few episodes, we've explored how the modern internet operates behind the scenes. The infrastructure supporting online services, the economic systems sustaining platforms, and the algorithms quietly shaping what people see online. But every so often, something breaks through into public attention in a much more visible way. A company announces a breach. Headlines appear everywhere. Millions of accounts affected, customer data exposed, passwords leaked. And for many people, these announcements create a strange mixture of confusion and anxiety. What does a data breach actually mean? What information was really stolen? What do attackers normally do with it? And how worried should ordinary people realistically be? Because despite how dramatic these announcements often sound, most people never fully understand what actually happened. And today, we're going to explore that process more clearly. At its simplest, a data breach means information was accessed by people who were not supposed to have access to it. That information may have been copied, stolen, exposed publicly, or retrieved through unauthorized access. Sometimes breaches happen through hacking, sometimes through software vulnerabilities, sometimes through stolen employee credentials, and sometimes through surprisingly simple mistakes, misconfigured cloud storage, poor security practices, accidentally exposing a database. But despite how the media often frames breaches, they are usually not scenes from a movie. Most breaches are not attackers individually targeting ordinary people one by one. Instead, they're typically large-scale attempts to acquire massive collections of data. Because of internet scale, data itself becomes valuable. When companies announce breaches, the wording can sometimes sound vague or alarming. Customer information may have been exposed. Certain account data was accessed. But in practice, the type of information involved is often fairly predictable. Things like email addresses, usernames, password hashes, phone numbers, billing addresses, account activity information. Sometimes payment information is involved, sometimes it's not. And importantly, many companies do not store passwords in plain text. Instead, passwords are usually stored as cryptographic hashes, transformed versions designed to make recovery more difficult. That does not make breaches harmless, but it does mean that reality is often more technical and less dramatic than people imagine. The danger depends heavily on what data was exposed and how well it was protected. One of the biggest misunderstandings about breaches is the idea that attackers always care deeply about specific individuals. Most of the time, they do not. What attackers usually want is scale. Millions of email addresses, large password databases, huge collections of account information. Because even if only a small percentage become useful later, the scale makes the operation worthwhile. For example, a leaked password might work on other websites if someone reused it elsewhere. An exposed email address might later be targeted with phishing attempts. A phone number may become useful for scams or impersonation attempts. Often, the real danger of data breaches appear gradually over time, rather than immediately. And this is why password reuse creates so much risk. Not because one single account is always extremely important, but because interconnected accounts create chains of vulnerabilities. One reason breaches create so much anxiety is that people often imagine worst-case scenarios immediately. Identity theft, bank accounts being emptied, devices being hacked remotely. And while severe outcomes can happen in some situations, most breaches do not instantly destroy people's lives. In many cases, breached information is fairly limited. Sometimes attackers never even use the stolen data publicly. Sometimes the information becomes outdated quickly. Sometimes the company resets passwords before the data becomes widely abused. This does not mean breaches should go ignored, but it does mean that panic is usually less useful than understanding. The internet is full of systems storing enormous amounts of data, and occasionally some of those systems fail. The important thing is responding calmly and realistically. When people hear about breaches affecting one of their accounts, the most useful response is usually practical rather than emotional. Change passwords for affected accounts, avoid reusing passwords across services, enable multi-factor authentication where possible, and remain cautious of phishing emails following major breaches. Because after public incidents, attackers often exploit fear and confusion through fake security alerts and scam messages. Ironically, secondary scams sometimes become more dangerous than the original breach itself, and over time, basic security habits tend to matter far more than reacting dramatically to a single incident. And such as strong unique passwords, a password manager, multi-factor authentication, careful handling of suspicious messages. These are protections that consistently reduce real-world risk. One uncomfortable reality of modern technology is that no large digital system is perfectly secure forever. Not governments, not corporations, and not technology companies. Modern systems are simply too large and too complex. Millions of lines of code, thousands of employees, huge interconnected networks, and attackers only need one weakness. This does not mean that security is pointless. In fact, most companies heavily invest in cybersecurity precisely because breaches are so damaging. But it does not mean breaches are not rare exceptions anymore. They are part of living in a highly connected digital world. And understanding that reality often makes these events feel less mysterious. Not because breaches are harmless, but because they become easier to place in context. At the beginning of this episode, we asked what actually happens during a data breach. And the answer is usually far less cinematic and far more systemic than people imagine. Most breaches involve large-scale collections of account information being exposed through technical failures, vulnerabilities, or stolen access. The real risk often emerges slowly: password reuse, phishing, fraud attempts, social engineering, and while no online system can ever be perfectly secure, calm and consistent security habits dramatically reduce most real-world risks. Because cybersecurity is rarely about achieving perfection. It's usually about reducing exposure, limiting damage, and responding intelligently when systems inevitably fail. Next time, we'll explore one of the fears most closely connected to breaches and online fraud: identity theft. What does identity theft actually look like in the real world? And how do criminals usually exploit stolen information? And why do most people misunderstand how these attacks actually happen? Thanks for listening, and in all this, stay calm and stay quietly secure.